This video is going to focus on the stomach. Once the food has been swallowed and passed through the esophagus, it's going to enter the stomach through the cardiac sphincter. That is it's not really a valve, it's a sphincter that the food is going to pass through to get into the stomach. The stomach is a muscular sac. It has 3 layers of muscle, and it's found in the left upper abdominal cavity. It is divided into 4 regions, but there's not really kind of lines to divide them, but into 4 regions. And its primary function is food storage. So it'll have a volume of 50 milliliters when empty, 1 to 1.5 liters after a typical meal, but could get up to a disgusting 4 liters when it's extremely full. That makes me sick to my stomach, actually. So 4 liters is its probably maximum capacity. At this point, the food that was a bolus when it was swallowed now is going to turn into a word that is weird, and it is called chyme. So the stomach itself is mechanically breaking up the food still, and is adding lots of liquid to the food. And so once those 2 things have happened in the stomach, we're going to call the food chyme. It does begin the chemical digestion of protein and fat, and we'll talk about the enzymes that do that. Most digestion is still occurring after the chyme has passed into the small intestines, and all of the absorption is going to happen in the small intestines. So really we think about the stomach as digesting, but really it's more storage. Okay, so there is our stomach, and you can see, this isn't labeled, but the cardiac sphincter is right at the entrance to the stomach. It shows you the pyloric sphincter is where the food, or the chyme, I should say, leaves the stomach, but there is a cardiac sphincter at the top too. And so we have 4 regions: fundic, cardiac, pyloric, and then the body of the stomach. And so the body is the largest region, and the pyloric region kind of narrows at the end, and that is the pyloric sphincter is where the chyme leaves the stomach. And then there's also 2 curvatures. So the lesser curvature is a small curve kind of on the inside of the stomach, and then the greater curvature on the outside. And then it shows where the greater omentum kind of connects to the stomach. And then this also shows the 3 layers of muscle, which we're going to talk about shortly. So just notice those on this picture. There are 3 layers of muscle that are all layers of smooth muscle, but they are pointing in different directions. So we have one layer of longitudinal muscle, a layer of circular muscle, and then a layer of oblique. This helps with the mechanical digestion of the food, breaking it up into smaller pieces. This is how our stomach contracts in more than one direction. So if we're looking at the microscopic anatomy, which we need to do to understand how all of these enzymes are secreted and what's actually happening in the stomach, it's going to be a little bit different than the esophagus, but still those same layers that we talked about in the first video, we will see them. So the mucosa layer is covered in a simple columnar epithelium, and it swells with water and begins mucus after the mucin is secreted. So they are secreting mucus, which is what you would expect in the mucosa. And then the mucosa and the submucosa are flat when the stomach is full, but forms these long wrinkles called gastric rugae when the stomach is empty, and they'll look like little folds. You should be able to see those in the lab, no problem. And then the muscularis externa, instead of 2 layers in the stomach, just like I showed you on the previous slide, we see 3 layers. So 3 smooth muscle layers going longitudinal, circular, and oblique. And then embedded in the mucosa, we see gastric pits. Okay, they are little depressions. They're lined with simple columnar epithelium. And 2 or 3 of these glands open up into the bottom of each gastric pit, which will look, the gastric pits is what it's called all over the stomach, but if we're in a certain region, such as the cardiac region, they're going to call cardiac glands, or pyloric region called the pyloric glands. And the rest of the stomach, we're going to call them gastric glands, but they are all at the bottom of each gastric pit. And here's kind of a zoomed in version of what that looks like. So we see these tall sections of the epithelium, and or of the inside of the mucosa, excuse me, and then the gastric pit. And then within those gastric pits, we see the gastric glands, and we're going to talk about what those do and the types of cells that are in each of those. Okay, so here's a closer up picture of the gastric gland, and you can see there's lots of different types of cells. So the book talks about that depending on where this gastric gland is in the stomach, we're going to see more or less of these different types of cells. But we see all 5 types of cells in all glands. Again, it's just going to depend on if we see more of a certain kind of cell depending on where we are in the stomach. So, but they all have 5 different types of cells. So mucus cells secretes mucus. That's easy. We see these more in the cardiac and pyloric glands. And then we have regenerative stem cells. They are found at the base of the pit, and they're dividing rapidly to make more new cells to replace the cells that died. And then parietal cells are found in the glands at the upper half of the gland, and they are secreting hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, and the hunger hormone. And we're going to talk more about HCl and the intrinsic factor, but those 2 are secreted by the parietal cells. The chief cells, they're called that because they're the most numerous. They are secreting gastric lipase, which is an enzyme, and pepsinogen, and we'll talk about what those enzymes do. These are in the gastric glands, and they're absent in the pyloric and cardiac glands. And then finally, the enteroendocrine cells are in the bottom part of the gland, or the lower end, and they are secreting hormones and paracrine messengers that are help to regulate digestion. Okay, so this is, I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about hydrochloric acid and how it is produced in the stomach. If you watch this in presenter view, you should be able to click this. This link should work. It just talks a little bit about hydrochloric acid production in the stomach, but our notes are going to go through that as well. So what the hydrochloric acid does is activates pepsin and lingual lipase. Those are both enzymes, again, to help actually break apart the substances in our food. They break up the connective tissues in the plant walls. This helps to liquefy our food and put it into that chyme, which is a liquid format before it moves on into the small intestines. The hydrochloric acid is able to convert our ferric ions into ferrous, and that's important because our body can absorb the ferrous ions and not the ferric, and the ferrous ions are needed for hemoglobin synthesis, so to actually make the protein hemoglobin, and we know we need a constant stream of that. So, and then the hydrochloric acid also helps keep away our diseases because they are the hydrochloric acid is such a low pH, it's so acidic that it destroys most ingested pathogens if they make it that far. Okay, so produced by the chief cells, we see an enzyme called gastric lipase. They play a minor role in digesting fats, so they digest 10 to 15% of fats in the stomach. But the rest are digested in the small intestine. Again, the stomach is really for still that mechanical digestion, but not all of the digestion is happening here. It's mostly going into the small intestine. Okay, and then the intrinsic factor that's secreted by the parietal cells. This is very important. This is really the only indispensable function of the stomach. So the stomach, these parietal cells secreting this intrinsic factor, they are essential to the absorption of the vitamin B12 by the small intestines. So the intrinsic factor is secreted in the stomach. It binds to B12, and then the cells in the intestines are going to absorb that complex. But we need B12 to be able to make hemoglobin again, and you know that we need our hemoglobin to be able to carry oxygen to all of our tissues. So without a stomach, you would definitely need a source of these intrinsic factors. So we can remove the stomach, but B12 supplements would be needed. So these enzymes help to digest proteins and a little bit of starch and fat in the stomach, but most digestion and then almost all absorption is occurring after the chyme has gone into the small intestine, and we'll talk about that in our next video. So the stomach does not absorb a significant amount of nutrients. It does absorb aspirin and some lipid-soluble drugs. But even alcohol is absorbed mainly by the small intestines. And so it depends on how rapidly the stomach is emptied, kind of how fast those effects are going to be noticed in each person. I'm going to go back for just a second. The last little bit in your book talks about kind of regulation of the stomach, and I don't really need you to go too much into that. If you're really interested, your book also has a section on vomiting, but we're going to leave the stomach here, and the next video will be over the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas and how they aid in this process.